I was invited for dinner one night to the Boehner house. John drove us up the hill. You know, to get to his house, you have to go up this hill. And so we're driving up this hill, and all these kids are running down the street. And I'm like, oh, these all the neighborhood kids? He's like, no, they're my brothers and sisters.
It was always a happening going to the Boehner's house. The parents were great. They were so calm, having that many kids.
They have 12 children and get through what the obstacles they got through and living very modestly. They were very wonderful people.
John was the second oldest, the little general. He'd be spouting orders. We'd come up the hill and you'd see the kids running because they know John was coming and he was going to be on their butt about something. And Earl, John's dad, ran the bar. His poor John had to get up at like 5 in the morning to go in with his dad, especially on the weekends. Through grade school, we went to Muller and became real good friends, played football all the years.
My job, besides being the football coach and the AD, was that I had to go out and go to all the schools and recruit students in our school district.
I met him in the 8th grade. He was walking through the classroom and patted me on the back and said, "Looking forward to you coming." I was pretty pumped up.
As you look back on it, he was the guy who taught us all kinds of values, to just not sit back and wait for life to come to you. It's to go get it.
He taught us there's nothing in this world that you can't accomplish, nothing that you can't succeed at. If you're willing to work hard enough, and if you're willing to make the sacrifices that are necessary.
You didn't make the Muller football team unless you were dedicated, unless you were a team player, unless you're willing to work and willing to give. And John had all those attributes.
I was driving a bulldozer in January of 1971, and this water would splash up on me and freeze. And that's when I decided maybe I better get my rear end back in school. So I spent the next 5 years going to night school, working full-time.
My first distinct memory of John was, 1972 probably. I saw him when he was emptying my garbage can. That's my first recollection of John as a janitor in khakis on the night shift. I told my dad, "Dad, I'm gonna marry this guy. He's a janitor, he's Catholic, and he's one of 12. You know, he was driven. You know, he was John.
He was kind of a self-made businessman. He was down in Kentucky selling boxes to a ham company. He was up in Toledo or somewhere selling boxes to who knows who. He was out aggressively going after business. He was doing exactly what I thought he wanted to do, and that's have his own business. He was successful at it. He was good at it.
Running for office, being in public service was the last thing I ever wanted to do. I was a successful business. I was making a lot of money. I was bored to death, I'll be the first one to admit. But I got involved in my neighborhood homeowners association.
The only thing that had was a pool, a swimming pool. And back in the day, I mean, he would paint the inside of the pool. He'd be the president of the board, and he suggested that they get involved in local politics. And they thought that was a great idea as long as he did it.
I didn't know anything about running a campaign or how you got elected, and neither did any of my friends who helped me.
And from there, it's exactly where he's at now. He just progressed from that into state government and into national politics.
He didn't want to do this. I mean, he was a state rep. His business was taking off. Some friends had approached him to run for Congress, and he had said no. He wrestled with the answer for about a month, and each morning he would get up and he'd go to St. John's Church and he'd pray about it. Apparently after a month he got the answer.
And when we rolled out our campaign in late October 1989, we spent all the money we had trying to drive up our numbers. And a couple of weeks after we found out that we were losing 87-5, it was disheartening.
Why were you successful when so many others around the country were not?
People throughout this country really do want Congress to change. And that's only going to happen if we do in fact get involved.
I just remember sitting in a rotunda with him right after he first got elected to Congress, just me and him, and talking about, man, Boehner, can you believe where you're at? And him saying, I can't believe it.
You know, there were only 7 Republicans elected that year, 1990. So it became the Gang of 7. You know, the first thing that came out, I think, was the check bouncing stuff that they uncovered.
The fact is, the American people are going to settle for nothing less than full disclosure.
The House members had bounced 8,226 checks. I thought, well, that's an awful lot of checks. There's only 435 of us. Well, you know, I grew up in a bar. I could smell these things a mile away. It turned out that there was 7 freshmen that showed up in my office that night. Became known as the Gang of 7, and we split up our duties. 4 days later, the bank was closed.
After that, he told me that he has a permanent indentation right here from other members poking him who weren't real happy with what was going on, because it went from the check bouncing to the restaurant and post office.
It began the process of reforming the way we do our business up here on the Hill.
2 years later, he's the conference chair. And they engineer a majority for the first time, and they take over the Congress.
You know, at that point, you realized he was a little different than the other however 100 members of Congress there are. But then, you know, that ship went over the cliff.
It's like a meteoric rise. And then in 98, Boehner was the last man standing at the time. And
I remember how hard that was, because I thought he was so good at what he was doing. And he lost that night, and I cried for like a week.
After losing my re-election as chairman of the Republican Conference, I have to tell you, it was pretty difficult. You know, I had to smile, I had to suck it up, but I did, because I vowed that I would never let them see me sweat.
John was a football player for Gerry Faust. He knew how to get back up and start over again.
And he comes back and he wins the education chair.
In 2001, I spent 90% of that year doing nothing but education. And at the end of the year, all of a sudden I've got this burning ember in my heart to help every kid to have a chance at a decent education. It's the great equalizer in America.
John didn't want to be senator. He didn't want to be president. His career would be in the House.
Mr. DeLay made his announcement in 2006 that he was stepping down. After Mass, we went up to Pete's Diner, where I had breakfast every morning, had breakfast, and came out of breakfast and my phone's ringing. And it was Coach Faust.
He says, Coach. I said, did I bother you? He says, no, I'm walking there. He says, you know, I was thinking about you. I was praying my rosary.
God's never talked to me directly, but this is about as close as I've ever come.
And I said, I want to tell you something. You're going for the majority leader. Don't quit. You never quit in high school. You may not get it the first time. It's just like football. You may have to long snap it more than once at the punt, but eventually we're going to win the game. You stick with it. He said, I will, Coach. He didn't. He wanted to think on the second ballot.
To lose the conference chair, to become chairman of the education workforce, to have a major bill passed, to then majority leader, soon to be minority leader, to claw our way back to retake the majority. I mean, honestly, if nothing else, his legacy ought to be scrapper.
He's an example of what can happen, but man, it's a long shot. He's the biggest long shot that I've ever seen.
It's still just me.
There's nothing that says in our past that here's the day it clicked that John's going to be Speaker of the House. I mean, there's nothing.
He was raised in a family with lots of siblings. His dad and mom owned a bar. They swept the floors, and that all sounds like storybook stuff. But the truth is, that's who John really is. I mean, he is as common as the day is long.
What I love about John is the glass is always half full and it's never half empty. And I think that is what has led him to get to where he is today.
My job today is being Speaker of the House. That means protecting the institution. It means trying to get people to work together It means accomplishing things on behalf of the American people. And as difficult as it all is, you know, every day there's some little step in the right direction. Sometimes you have to look pretty hard to find them, but having those little successes, staying at it, succeeding in the mission, that's what keeps me going.